everyone. This is Afternoon Live. I'm Simon McCoy. President Trump has warned Russia to get ready for missile strikes in Syria in response to the alleged chemical attack in the town of Douma at the weekend. Russia had earlier urged the United States not to take military action. Downing Street says Britain is working with the US and France to decide its response if the Syrian regime is found to be responsible. The World Health Organization says 500 people in Douma have shown symptoms consistent with exposure to toxic chemicals and is demanding immediate access to the area. Here's our diplomatic correspondent, Paul Adams.
The long, painful evacuation from Douma goes on. Buses carrying exhausted civilians and fighters arriving in northern Syria yesterday. These people left just after Saturday's alleged chemical weapons strike. The diplomatic crisis triggered by that attack now causing deadlock in New York. At the UN Security Council, 3 votes but no agreement on how to investigate what happened in Douma. Donald Trump's representative rounding on Russia.
History will record that on this day, Russia chose protecting a monster over the lives of the Syrian people.
A year ago, America fired 60 cruise missiles at the Shayrat Air Force Base after another chemical weapons attack against civilians. But the base was soon up and running, and the chemical weapons attacks didn't stop. Russia took no action then, but warns this time will be different.
If there is a strike by the Americans, then we point to declarations made by President Putin and the Russian military leadership that the missiles will be downed, and even the sources from which the missiles were fired.
The ambassador was speaking in Arabic for a pro-Syrian audience, the threats almost certainly exaggerated. But Donald Trump responded anyway. "Get ready, Russia," he tweeted this morning, "because missiles will be coming, nice and new and smart. You shouldn't be partners with a gas-killing animal who kills his people and enjoys it." But the Russian presence in Syria is substantial. To hit them, even by accident, could have dangerous consequences.
To avoid a potential conflict with the Russians, we've got to be very careful in our targeting. This is where the intelligence community has really got to earn its pay and ensure that those targets that are selected are ones that are going to strike the Syrian regime, and the Syrian regime only, its chemical warfare capability, and ensure absolutely that Russian personnel and Russian equipment and aircraft in particular are not targeted.
France's President Macron says military action will only target Syria's chemical facilities, not the regime's allies. He says a decision will be made in the coming days. Russia insists no chemical weapons were used in Douma, but the World Health Organization says the evidence is there. In particular, it says there were signs of severe irritation of mucous membranes, respiratory failure and disruption to central nervous systems of those exposed. 5 years ago, Syria appeared to cooperate with international inspectors in an effort to remove all the country's chemical weapons. Now it seems the West is getting ready to take a rather different approach. Paul Adams, BBC News.
Our Middle East correspondent Martin Patience is in Beirut for us. Watching these tweets from the President, it's not if, it's when, and it could be quite soon.
I think there's a real sense of nervousness across this region, and these tweets certainly aren't helping. If the action, as most in this region expect, if it matches that rhetoric, then it will be very serious indeed. All of that said, we saw the first tweet, and then it was followed up by a more conciliatory tweet where Donald Trump seemed to be suggesting that Russia and America needed to work together. So it appeared to be a routine of good cop, bad cop, where the only cop happens to be the President of the United States. But there is a sense the military action will be carried out. When that will happen, nobody knows. But in Syria itself, the government are taking this very seriously. We have had accounts of them removing personnel from military installations as well as intelligence branches and government offices that could potentially be targeted in any American military action.
Yeah, that's the point. We don't know if this does happen what the targets would be. All that Donald Trump is saying is at the moment is that the missiles, when they come, they'll be nice and new and smart.
Yeah, I mean, what's really interesting, the focus is obviously on the chemical attack, in Syria. Donald Trump has said that he wants to punish, as he puts it, animal Assad. But the bigger issue, the bigger agenda is between Russia and America. And the concern is that a confrontation in Syria, in some ways acting as a stage, could trigger something potentially far more serious. But it's very complex on the ground. If, for example, America wants to target the Syrian government, well, the Syrian government is supported by Russia, supported by Iran, and it's very difficult to separate the two. And that could mean drawing some kind of response from either of those countries. And then you have to factor in Israel. It's the wild card factor in all of this. On Monday, it was accused of carrying out airstrikes on an airbase in northern Syria. It hasn't commented. But both the Russians, the Iranians, and the Syrian government have all accused them of carrying it out. We don't know what Israel's going to potentially do in the coming days as well. And with so many players, you have to calibrate any military action very carefully, because it could potentially draw a response which then leads to an escalation of the violence, not just in Syria, but potentially across the region. That is the big fear here.
Martin, thank you very much. That's Martin Patience there in Beirut. More than 250 people have been killed in a military plane crash in Algeria. The aircraft came down about 20 miles southwest of the capital, Algiers, shortly after taking off from a military airport. This report now from Sophie Long.
This is what remains of the Aleutian military transport plane that took off from Bafarik Air Base near the Algerian capital. According to state television, it was heading to the town of Béchar, close to the border with Morocco. But shortly after takeoff, something caused it to plummet and crash into a nearby field, killing more than 250 people on board. Emergency services were quickly at the scene, with firefighters working alongside members of the Civil Protection Service to put out the fire. The Algerian Defence Ministry has confirmed at least 257 people have been killed, including the plane's 10 crew and 247 passengers. Most of them were soldiers, but some members of their families were also travelling with them. According to local media, among the military personnel on board were several members of the Polisario Front, an Algerian-backed group seeking independence for the Western Sahara. Algeria's army chief is now overseeing the rescue effort and has ordered an urgent investigation to find out what happened, what caused this military plane to experience such catastrophic problems so soon after takeoff. Sophie Long, BBC News.
Now, after weeks of turmoil surrounding his company over the improper use of personal data, Mark Zuckerberg has insisted he's still the right person to lead Facebook. The company now says the British firm Cambridge Analytica may have used information from 87 million people. Australia has now opened a formal investigation into Facebook after it was revealed that the data of 300,000 users there was used without their permission. Dave Lee is in Washington and sent this report.
Mark Zuckerberg's first ever appearance in Congress was a 5-hour slog, as senators, 43 of them, grilled the 33-year-old about the slew of scandals facing his social network.
We didn't take a broad enough view of our responsibility, and that was a big mistake. And it was my mistake, and I'm sorry. I started Facebook, I run it, and I'm responsible for what happens here.
Let me just cut to the chase.
It began with questions about Cambridge Analytica, the firm that is alleged to have fraudulently obtained data on around 87 million Facebook users, something it denies. Mr. Zuckerberg's goal in coming here was to provide senators with assurances that he could navigate Facebook out of the mess it's found itself in and avoid what some feel is inevitable new regulations around handling data.
Mr. Zuckerberg, would you be comfortable sharing with us the name of the hotel you stayed in last night?
No.
I think that may be what this is all about.
As part of that effort, he said it would be more difficult in future to spread misinformation on Facebook, but again apologised for being caught mostly unawares when Russians targeted the platform in 2016.
We expected them to do a number of more traditional cyber attacks, which we did identify and notify the campaigns that they were trying to hack into them, but we were slow at identifying the type of new information operations.
Who's your biggest competitor?
Under question here is the future of Facebook's business model, one which uses information on its users to sell targeted advertising. There are others who feel the company has become too big and powerful.
Facebook is a monopoly. It is abusing its power. It is too big. And that's what I really hope they get to grips with in round two.
Mr. Zuckerberg would not rule out one day charging people to use Facebook, but said there would always be a free version at least. Dave Lee, BBC News, Washington.
Joining me now, Rory Cafton-Jones, our technology correspondent. How do you think he did yesterday?
I think it was a bit of a score draw. He looked uncomfortable at times. He was in a suit. Somebody said it was an ill-fitting suit. I thought it looked a very nice suit. But it was obviously a different environment.
It wouldn't have been cheap.
It was not a cheap suit, certainly not.
And just talking about money for a moment, during his evidence, his personal wealth went up £3 billion because the shares in Facebook went up 5%.
Yeah, which is an interesting measure. I mean, throughout all this crisis, we've looked at what's happened to Facebook shares and said, oh, it's in trouble. The stock market looked at what was happening during that hearing and decided he probably wasn't in that much trouble, and the value of the company rose by nearly 5%. And I've been just hearing about some figures coming out soon showing a continued huge rise in the value of the advertising the company gets. And so, you know, at the crudest level, they'll be thinking, are our advertisers being put off? Because they're our real customers, not these 2 billion users, and they're not. But he does face another grilling here, and one can hope, perhaps, that it'll be a bit more focused on one particular area, which is regulation. There's been a lot of talk of regulation, and he made some sort of concession last night. In principle, I think it makes sense. The details matter. I look forward to having our team work with you on fleshing that out, he said when asked about regulations. So maybe they'll focus in on that bit, but what I'm not clear about is what regulation of Facebook would actually look like.
At times, it felt a bit uncomfortable. Someone tweeted that it was, you know, every youngster's nightmare is trying to explain tech stuff to an older generation, and it had that.
How they felt. Yeah.
I know exactly how they felt, but it had that feel about it at times.
It did. I mean, there were a couple of the senators who didn't seem to quite understand how Facebook worked. For instance, how do you make your money? How do you make your money, which you'd think was obvious, and then was at the root of the whole problem. So he had to be slightly patient there. But there were others who really zeroed in. I thought that question, which sounded like a joke about are you going to share with us where you stayed last night, was rather clever, because it basically got to the heart of the matter that we're all sharing our information with him, Mark Zuckerberg, and we probably don't realise how sensitive that data is, and how somebody like him would not be willing to share that data.
Now, he probably felt he came out of that reasonably well yesterday. Today could be slightly different, as you say. The questions could be slightly tougher.
Yeah, I mean, one hopes that the committee will have looked at what happened yesterday and learned some questions, learned to maybe zero in, go for the supplementary. When he says, yeah, we would be prepared to accept some sort of regulation, come up with some examples. For instance, there's been a lot of talk over the years of should Facebook be treated as a media company. Media companies in this country, and to a certain extent in the United States, face a lot of regulation. Would he be prepared for that? I suspect not.
Now, what he said yesterday was the word sorry. He said it several times. That's something you've picked up in the past when Facebook has issued messages to Facebook users. How many people have been told so far that they have fallen foul of the Cambridge Analytica row?
Well, we know that 87 million people are due to get that message that was supposed to start going out. It seems to have rolled out very slowly, although there is a way which you can see details of it on the BBC website of how to find out, how to actually make that message come to you. But yeah, not an awful lot. But those that have, I think it's really interesting. I've spoken to a couple of people who have had the message, and they have been taken aback, and they have felt that sort of their trust has been abused. Of course, not only their trust in Facebook itself, but with their friends, because their data has been exposed because their friends, and they don't know which friend, downloaded this personality quiz app, and that in turn shared their data with this company, Cambridge Analytica, and we don't know how that data was used.
As I mentioned in the introduction, Australia is now also launching an investigation into Facebook. There are calls for him, Mark Zuckerberg, to come to the Commons here. Calls at the moment he's not acceding to. I mean, how far through this crisis is he right now?
I think this is a permanent crisis, really. I think this is the new reality for Mark Zuckerberg. And there are two ways of looking at it. That he will be eventually ground down by it and, will have to, maybe step aside and let somebody else take over. I think what's more likely is that he's quite astute. He'll learn how to deal with it. He'll learn how to ride the wave. And as long as his investors are happy, he won't be in too much trouble. Yeah, and we talked about the amount of money he made during the hearing yesterday. But, of course, Facebook's shares have plunged in recent weeks. Yeah, but you've got to look at what they've done over the last 5 years or so, and particularly the last 12 months they've gone way up, then they've come down sort of 5–10%, and now they're on their way up again. So it's a blip, but it's still one of the most valuable companies in the world. And along with Google, it's got this hugely dominant position in this new gold rush, mobile advertising. So in many ways, it's quite difficult to see that being challenged. OK, Rory. Thank you very much for that. Well, he's back on 3. Yeah. And you'll be joining us, I hope, later on. Yeah. Thank you. Rory Cellan-Jones there. You're watching Afternoon Live here on BBC News. Our headlines this afternoon. Get ready for missiles. President Trump warns Russia on Twitter as the war of words over the suspected chemical attack in Syria intensifies. Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg faces more questions from US lawmakers in Washington this afternoon. At least 257 people have been killed after a military plane crashed shortly after takeoff in Algeria.
In sport, at the Commonwealth, Jack Law retained his 1-metre springboard title. It was England's first diving gold of the Games, following up the silver won by Alicia Bragg and Catherine Torrance. Scotland have achieved their highest medal tally at an away Games. David McMath won their 7th gold so far. It came in the double trap shooting. 34 medals are now guaranteed. And Anya Shrubsole is one of 3 England women's cricketers on the list for Wisden's Cricketer of the Year, following their World Cup winning success. Only 2 women have ever made the list before. I'll be back with more on all of those stories at around past.